Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we apologize that we are a little late. We didn't think we would have the full room, truly full, and this one is occupied. We couldn't get the other one, so more chairs will be coming, maybe in front, wherever. So please just excuse the disturbances. But, pardon me? Lower the screen in the okay. Yeah. Okay, I will ask Nick. Nick? Yeah. All right, coming up, your wish is our desire, your wish is our command. Thank you. So, good afternoon. Dobry dzień. Здравствуйте. You are going to be taken to Russia. You're going to be taken to Ukraine. You're not going to be entertained as you were in a cabaret, but you're going to be educated and you're going to truly enjoy what you're going to be learning. Daily, we're confronted with news about Ukraine, about Russia, about Putin, about all the tensions that are expanding beyond those borders into Europe. And that is a serious and a concern that is not just for Europeans, but also very much for us. So who better to provide insight into all of these extremely complicated relationships than Professor David Fenner? And I believe this is the third time that you are here at this podium. And I hope you will be coming back and back and back. Professor Fenner is an affiliate faculty member at the University of Washington Jackson School of International Studies. He also served as the UW Assistant Vice Provost for International Education. Russia, formerly the USSR, and incidentally the Arab world as well, are most familiar territories for him. He speaks Russian, he speaks Arab languages. His first of many visits to the USSR was in 1973. That was still in the depth of communism. In fact, in the late 1970s, he studied at the Leningrad State University. I think I have that right. And incidentally, my grandfather had a degree from that university. This was in the 19th century. In 1987, still under communism, Professor Fenner led a UW delegation to negotiate and sign the first non-ministry agreement between the Soviet and an American university, being the University of Washington and Tashkent University. That was a big deal. In those days, to have this kind of an agreement between a communist system and the free world, it cannot even be described. And that agreement is still in force now, nearly 40 years later. And then in 2021, he received the UW Award for Distinguished Contributions to Lifelong Learning. And I think we are an example of that, this lifelong learning. And if you Google David Fenner, you will find a very charming photograph of him with Mr. Mikhail Gorbachev. Please welcome David Fenner.
Ina, I am delighted to be back at or in both Horizon House and to see so many of you here. One of the things that struck me over the years is that you all have a commitment to civic engagement and cultural engagement and political engagement that is well understood out in Seattle, Western Washington writ large. You have a wonderful tradition of doing exactly what Ina has mentioned, which is a commitment to lifelong learning, life of the mind, no matter how many years ago it was you were in the classroom. And so it makes it really easy for people like me to come in, share information with you because you literally drink it up. And so I really appreciate this opportunity. I also appreciate the fact that you have come together in about the bottom of the fourth inning. So your commitment to lifelong learning even pardon the expression, trumps your interest in baseball. I'm told by my earpiece that we are in fact ahead already. So no guarantees, however, what could happen next. But I will keep you for a while because there's so much territory to cover. But I promise you'll be freed up at least by the 15th inning. We're going to cover some other territory today that you may not have expected, but we've got a lot on the agenda. First of all, I want to thank you for having me, and I'll give you some background information about me, and importantly, I need to go on record as being a biased presenter. I am a hopeless Slavophile. I am a hopeless Russophile. I am a hopeless Ukrainophile. I'm a hopeless Lithuanianophile. And I also, at the same time, think that Vladimir Putin is one of the cads of the last 200 years, on a par with people like Idi Amin, Saddam Hussein. He shines in, to my mind, his willingness to sacrifice his people, his culture, his country's reputation for his own aims. And so you'll see that, forgive me for being biased, but you'll see that come across in today's presentation. Before I get any further, however, we have to go back to the first slide, which says an important word here is conversation. We will have time at the end for Q&A, and this is really the best part always of any presentation that I give, because it's a time to connect what you're really interested in with what may be some more additional information than you have had before. So conversation, keep that in mind. There are two things that you need to do to loosen up your vocal cords so that you feel really comfortable and brave to ask a question. And we're going to do both of those things in a minute. So we're going to learn a little Ukrainian, which is going to give your cords a chance to warm up. We're going to try to understand what is called in Russian mirovozhrenia, the worldview of Vladimir Putin. It is not easy to understand on the one hand, and on the other hand, to my mind, the word imperial captures it. As John McCain said, that Russia is not a country, it's a mafia state that is masquerading as a gas station. And John McCain, where would we be without him in our past, but wouldn't it be nice to have a whole bunch of him still? A real American hero. We're going to also delve into Ukrainian history to a good extent that maybe you haven't been as familiar with, it having been lumped into the Russian Empire for so long and then lumped into the Soviet Union for so long. We're going to try to disaggregate it in a way. We'll try to understand Vladimir Putin, which is a tortuous process, but we'll see what we can do. And we'll give you an update on where the war stands today. We'll briefly talk about that event in Anchorage in August where Vladimir Putin and President Trump met. We'll look at your resource list and your timeline, which are important documents. And then finally, we get to the Q&A. And even though I said finally, I'm unable to ever give a presentation without a benediction. from the Latin, good word. I'm going to leave you with some good words that hopefully will have you sort of waltzing out of here rather than dragging your feet behind you. But the first thing we're going to do is practice some Ukrainian. So if you would repeat after me, Slava. I had a French teacher in high school. She said, the secret to learning any foreign language is being bold. Let's try that again. Slava. Ah, that's beautiful. Ukraini. Slava Ukraini. This is sort of the rallying call for all Ukrainians around the world and the people who support them. It means literally glory to Ukraine. And there's a response to it that has started to become even more popular, and that is Heroyam Slava. Heroyam Slava. To the heroes go the glory. You may wonder why I'm here. Ina gave you a little bit of an indication of my background and my academic interests, but I also have a little bit of a, what's the right word? Dennis the Menace approach to international education and world learning. When I was 19, I was studying in Yugoslavia with a professor at the University of Belgrade. And we were trying to, about 5-6 of us Americans were trying to figure out whether or not self-management socialism, autogestion as the French called it, was that beautiful mid-road between heartless capitalism on one side and headless communism on the other side. And we thought if we went to Yugoslavia, we'd be able to see if there were in fact a middle ground. Well, one day at the university, a group of Yugoslav students said, hey, you guys, meaning us Americans, we're going on a 2-week tour of the Soviet Union by train. Why don't you come with us? So for a couple weeks, we traveled as Yugoslav students, although we had our blue passports. We went to Kyiv, we went to Moscow, we went to St. Petersburg, then called Leningrad. And one of the things we learned about the Soviet Union as we were making this tour was that they had tried to put a complete and utter ban on rock and roll music. This is 1973, when the Western world had come out of the 60s and early 70s buoyed by rock and roll music, and yet the Soviets thought that they could keep it out because it was corrupt, it was decadent, it was Western, everything about it was bad. So one of the other Americans and I, Donna, in fact, Donna was from Puyallup of all places. Donna and I made a kind of a pact that whenever we found an unguarded piano in the Soviet Union, we would sit down and play rock and roll music. Well, being naive and innocent, as Mark Twain said, and innocent abroad, Donna and I discovered a beautiful Imperial Concert Grand Bösendorfer piano in Lenin's apartment in the Kremlin. You're looking at this piano right now, and Donna and I decided that we would try to figure out a way to play some rock and roll music on it. And you may know about the Imperial Grand that Bösendorfer produced for many years, maybe still. It has 9 extra bass keys so that you could really play some bass notes on this beautiful piano. And as soon as Donna and I, Donna, a actual pianist, unlike me, Donna and I nodded to each other. And though you may find this hard to believe, when the group of about 20 of us all told was ushering itself out of Lenin's apartment in a museum of an apartment in the Kremlin, Donna and I stood behind these curtains. And as soon as we heard the door click shut, we came out and I sat down on the bass side of things, always wanted to play a Bösendorfer, and she sat down up here and I started doing this. And then Donna started doing this. And then we felt 4 hands picking up our shoulders off the piano bench, and the head of that section of the museum was livid that we had sat down in an unauthorized way and played the piano in Lenin's apartment. And he said, "This is tremendous insult to Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who was founder of great Soviet socialist republics." And as he pushing us out the door, saying, "Idi von, run away, go away, get out of here," he leaned over to me and he said, "By the way, was it Johnny Be Good?" So rock and roll had crept in before we got there. Even this sort of middle-aged guy was up to date on that song. There's another reason why I'm here and why I think Russia was so important to me. As a graduate student at the University of Washington, I had a bunch of campus jobs. One of them was in the map room in the very basement of Suzzalo Library, for those of you that know the campus. Back in the day, faculty members would come and check out a map that they would use the next day in their geography class or their Jackson School class or their language class. And so my job was to sit there, and they gave me the Friday night shift, and there was never anybody in there. And I was sitting there minding my own business, reading some Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or something, and I'm look up from my little desk at the podium, at the little entry station, and in walks a beautiful woman, about 22, and she goes up to this very map on the wall and stands in front of it like this for the longest time. And I work up my courage to go up behind her and say, "Well, excuse me for interrupting, but may I help you in any way?" And she looked at the map, and she looked at me and she said, "No, I'm just trying to get my bearings straight." Next month, she and I celebrate 48 years of marriage. So I am stuck finding real meaning in the connection between Russia and the United States, between the Soviet Union too. We could talk about the Romanov dynasty forever because there's so much to talk about, but we're not going to. 300 and some years of tsars and tsarinas who ruled the Rus in an autocratic way. We could talk at a great length, too, about the Soviet period, 75, 76 years of control after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. You'll recognize the characters on this screen. Lenin there, Stalin on the far side, followed by Khrushchev on the bottom left, Brezhnev, who was the general secretary when I was studying in the Soviet Union, and then finally Mikhail Gorbachev that Ina mentioned. We'll see a picture of him in a few minutes. But poor Gorbachev was the inheritor of all of the sort of dead weight of the Russian Empire and absolutely decayed weight of the Soviet period, and he was trying to both reform the Soviet Union and preserve it. But as he said in one of his memoirs, the difficulty was that I, Gorbachev, was trying to be both the Pope and Martin Luther. He was unable to do both of those things, and as we all know, by 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart. It fell apart in a dramatic way, even though there were very few shots fired, even though that some of the republics that withdrew from the Soviet Union did cause a kind of a Soviet violent reaction. But the two main characteristics of the 1990s, the whole decade really, was there was tremendous flowering of rights and privileges, a free press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom to travel. All sorts of people, for the first time in their lives, had an opportunity to go abroad. But at the same time, it was coupled with intense poverty and economic chaos, because they were taking all of the assets of the Soviet Union and trying to figure out how to distribute them out into what was then, in those days, almost 300 million people. They didn't do a very good job of this. And there were all sorts of people who were opposed to Gorbachev, who wanted to reinstate the Soviet system. And there was, as you may remember, a coup in 1991 in late summer. And this is when a man named Boris Yeltsin, comes upon the scene. He's the head of the Russian Federated Soviet Socialist Republic, a constituent republic, and an intense adversary to Gorbachev. Yeltsin thought that there should be much more reform more quickly, and Gorbachev was trying to put on the brakes. But this is what it looked like in the Soviet Union when I went to visit there in the early 1990s. This was one of the grocery stores that I went into. At the same time, as I mentioned, the freedom of travel allowed some of my friends from St. Petersburg to come west, and I had several groups of them coming to visit us in Seattle. We made the mistake, probably, of going with one couple to the QFC at U Village. And she was going from her reality back in the Soviet Union, back in Russia now, of this to the QFC at U Village, and we lost her. And we finally found her in the salad dressing section, and she was counting them. And she said to her husband, they have 79 salad dressings. And appropriate for the Soviet era, her husband looked at her and said, "It's okay, Tanya. We don't have salad." The world economy, at least if you were an oil-producing and exporting country, was going through tremendous depressed period of oil development. This is just an extraordinary graph, but you look right here, when it gets to the Arab oil embargo in 1973, look what happens to the prices. But when you get to the 1990s, if you're an oil-producing country, look, you're down in the troughs of very low prices for your oil and gas. And as you probably know from reading the news these days, oil and gas are just about the only commodities that Russia has to offer. One of the surviving poets of the Soviet period was a Ukrainian-born poet named Yevgeny Yevtushenko. And Yevtushenko had a long career. He somehow managed to avoid the centers most of the time, but he was able really to sort of peer into what made Russia and Ukraine tick at that point. And he said this about the 1990s. He said, "We believed that freedom had a beautiful face." And she does, along with 99 ugly ones. Living through this economic chaos of the 1990s soured many people on this Western model of economic development and political freedoms. And it ripened the country for the arrival of a strong man. You'll see where we're going with this. It also harkened back to a long tradition in Russia and Ukraine of aristocrats, landowners, who would sort of do the bidding of the Tsar or the Hetman or the Sultan and get land and, importantly, serfs as a result of their service to the Tsar or the king. And those boyars sort of developed a model that has stuck around in all of the parts of the former Soviet Union. But today we call them oligarchs. And Yeltsin quickly surrounded himself with a whole bunch of young entrepreneurial, many of them actually capable, who were there when Boris Yeltsin and his team tried to figure out how to privatize all of those Soviet assets. And the challenge was so large as you start to think of it, because there were no assets in the Soviet Union except state assets. So they had this 11 time zones worth of country, mineral rich, resource rich, and absolutely no way to try to figure out how to privatize it. They end up finding a dozen or so people, and they simply carve up the pie. And those oligarchs get the mining industries, the transportation industries, the communication industries, the oil and gas industries. And then what they've done is they've divvied up the pie, but the oligarchs are getting it all. The common man and woman aren't getting it at all. Yeltsin is elected president of something now called the Russian Federation, Ruskaya Federatsiya, and he is probably elected in free and fair elections, the first ones ever in Russia in its 1,000-year-old history. And he had, as I mentioned, a whole series of real challenges, but one of them was that he also suffered from alcoholism and was very often drunk in charge and drunk in public and drunk on television. He also, like the oligarchs, was making sure that his family was going to do pretty darn well in the disposition of all of those assets. And so he started to worry late in his career about whether or not he would be held liable for fleecing his country. And he started looking for a prime minister who could succeed him. And you probably know this, but you may not. He went through 7 prime ministers during his 8 years in office. And the last one was a young man named Vladimir Putin. The general consensus is that he had to find somebody who would guarantee his security, guarantee that he wouldn't be prosecuted, guarantee that he wouldn't be put in prison or have all of that wealth snatched back. And on December 31st of 1999, having gotten those assurances from Putin, Yeltsin goes on television every year. They did this during the Soviet period. On December 31st, the general secretary of the party would give a kind of State of the Union address. But at the first lines of this address in December 31st of 1999 were, "Hello, dear people of the Russian Federation. I am resigning the office of president," leaving it in the hands of the prime minister, Vladimir Putin. Putin goes on television the next morning and says some extraordinary things to the Russian people. I don't know if you can see these, but in his address he says, assuring the people of Russia, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of the press, and property rights, all the fundamental elements of a civilized society will be reliably protected by the state. Not one word in that sentence is true. And for the next 25 years, he has been whittling away, sometimes chopping away, at the rights and privileges that were guaranteed to the Russian people in the 1990s. Still, he's young, he's vibrant, he speaks a foreign language, German in this case, and finally, there's somebody who, as one of my friends in St. Petersburg says, finally, a Russian leader whose suits fit. Soviet humor and Russian humor is unsurpassed, I think. But he is elected again in a free and fair election in the year 2000. He overwhelmingly wins in the vote and becomes the president of the Russian Federation, and has been it almost without an interval ever since. Pretty soon he makes the rounds on the world stage, and he meets George W. Bush in 2001, just shortly after he becomes president. And George Bush is, you're probably all familiar with this quote, "I looked the man in the eye," meaning Putin, in the eye, "and I got a sense of his soul." John McCain quickly said on the Sunday morning news programs, "I looked Putin in the eye, and I just saw 3 letters, KGB." George W. Bush, though, was quite taken with Putin, as all of the American presidents since Putin took over have tried to sort of curry favor with him. It's the most interesting geopolitical phenomenon. But here is George Bush and Vladimir Putin driving around with Bush at the wheel of a vintage Volga automobile. So why am I telling you? Why am I, of all people, giving you all this background? Well, in the fall of 1952, under Stalin on one side and Dwight Eisenhower on the other side, both Vladimir Putin and I are born. So we are exactly the same age. We have both played this piano. As Ina mentioned, we both attended Leningrad State University. He was in the law department here, the Green Building, and I in the humanities department right behind. As far as I know, we never saw each other. When he got back from his posting as a KGB agent in Germany, a KGB major in Germany, he and I both worked at the international offices of the main universities there. And to suggest even a closer connection, he and I have both had a meaningful conversation with Mikhail Gorbachev. There I am, as Ina has mentioned, in one of my more youthful images. I was quite nervous when I met the former General Secretary, and I was practicing a good speech for him because I knew I was going to have a chance to meet him, and I wanted to say thank you for the hospitality of the Russian people. Спасибо за гостеприимность русского народа. So it's a short little phrase, and I screw it badly up. And Gorbachev just sort of looks at me, and he opens his arms up and gives me a bear hug. You okay? But it was like hugging the Pillsbury Doughboy. I just disappeared into him. I still feel this, just as I describe it for you. He just embraced me, and we somehow became one. So both Putin and I have talked to Gorbachev. Putin held Gorbachev responsible for the dissolution of the Soviet Union. There's one more similarity that may surprise you. Both of our grown children are billionaire oligarchs. No, I guess it was only Putin that... Putin is born in Leningrad, not far from where my dormitory was. His parents survived, as you all know from your World War II history, the almost 1,000-day, 900-day siege of Leningrad by the Third Reich as they attacked northern Russia. And it was a bleak, very bleak time, and a bleak time to try to survive and then eventually have a family. In one of his autobiographies, Putin writes that it was tough for him growing up as a sort of a short, belligerent young boy, but he addressed that by going out onto the play yard of his schools and picking a fight with the biggest guy. And he always lost. But he got a reputation for being fearless and brave and who knows what, maybe foolish. He grows up in the sort of rough and tumble years of the 80s and the 90s in St. Petersburg, eventually named St. Petersburg, and it runs with a pretty tough crowd. Manages somehow, though he is not by any stretch of the imagination dim, he is very clever in a kind of cunning sense. He gets into Leningrad State University, he gets into the law faculty, and then he applies when he graduates to work in the KGB. He had an idea that he was going to be the sort of James Bond of Russia, but instead he's sent to the backwater of Dresden in East Germany and asked to work in conjunction with the Stasi, the Secret Service in Germany. He gets to the rank of major in that service. He lives in Germany for about 6 years. And then, as you all know, by the end of the 1980s, Germany starts to, what's the right word? Metamorphose into the country that it is today. The wall comes down in 1989. An angry mob in Dresden starts heading toward Putin's offices there, and he is able to convince them that he's got a whole squadron of armed Russian army soldiers behind him just waiting to open fire on the crowd, and the crowd turns and goes somewhere else. There were no soldiers. There were no arms in this building. Mendacity is one of the cornerstones of Putin's character. He comes back to Leningrad, as I mentioned, works at the university for a while, and then Anatoly Sobchak, a colleague from Leningrad State University, becomes elected mayor of St. Petersburg, and he picks Putin out of sort of obscurity at the university and says, "Let me make you my deputy mayor." And it is at this point in Putin's career that he starts his ambition to be much, much more than either second fiddle or a junior KGB officer. He really wants power. And this is the oddest part of his biography, to my mind. He commissions, while being deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, a film, 12-minute long film made about himself. And the film is called Vlast, or Power. And the funniest things about the film are, you're about to hear them in a minute, but it is a silent film. There's no dialogue. You see people's mouths moving, but there's no talking. There's only a soundtrack of a single song played over and over and over again. To try to get you to share with you a sense of how odd this was in certainly the immediate post-Soviet context, and now in the modern Russian context, is that every kind of promotional propaganda video like this would include, in the Soviet period, would include a patriotic march of a song that everybody would recognize in Russia, and their pride and their nationalism would just bubble up to the surface. And I want to give you a chance to participate in that song, and then I'm going to play the soundtrack of the movie, of the little film. So, a couple of things you need to know, and this is where you get your arms exercised so that you can raise your hand. Let's just try it. When the Q&A, oh, this is good. I don't know who to call on. One of the things that you can't stop yourself from doing is clapping to the beat of these patriotic Russian songs, most that have come from Russian folk songs. And so the other thing you need to know is that all of these patriotic Russian songs were in 4/4 time, and the beat was always on the second and the fourth beat note in each of those phrases. So if you would repeat after me with your hands, get them ready. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, the secret to, my French teacher would say, the secret to clapping is being bold. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, keep that up. Let's just try it slowly. Oh, and there must be a musical term for this, but we get faster and faster and faster. We accelerate our pride in our country. So let's try it again. 1, 2. That's pretty good. Okay, here's the real test. Here it comes. You gotta go faster. You got it. You're good at this. Now, this is what you're used to when you're a Russian citizen and you're seeing a propaganda video come by. That's what the song you're used to. And this is the soundtrack. Remember, it's a silent film. This is the soundtrack. Silently answering the telephone. Wordlessly opening a file cabinet. Meeting with a group of concerned citizens and nodding. A whole new era has begun in Russia, and Putin is pulling every possible heartstring to have him be at the zenith, at the apex of that new era. It's just incredible. And he now starts to consolidate power. And it's important to remember, I've put that there are only 2.5 presidents of the Russian Federation for the last 30-some years. And it's Yeltsin, of course, and now Putin, of course. But you may also remember Dmitry Medvedev. So I've tucked him in there appropriately sized. Dmitry Medvedev took the place of Putin for 4 years, from 2008 to 2012, and was the, I guess, caretaker president of the Russian Federation. And then with several constitution changes and the Duma being kind of a lapdog legislature, Putin was able to figure out ways of staying in power forever. One footnote to all of this is that you may not necessarily recognize the name Medvedev. It actually comes from the Russian root for bear, and it's a pretty common surname in Russia. In fact, it was the surname, when he came through Ellis Island, of Rachel Maddow's grandfather. I knew you'd remember something from today, and that will be it. Putin starts to consolidate power. He starts whittling away at rights. He starts re-peopling the ranks of his oligarchs and making sure that they're just as corrupt as he is, so that if they ever try to turn on him, he can say, well, you don't have exactly a clean slate here. We could talk more about how he did that. The free press really starts to disappear, even though it had flourished in the 1990s. His political opponents either become dead or defenestrated or in prison or they emigrate. He has elections every 4 years. Elections. The state gets more and more involved in virtually everything, and he determines virtually everything about how the economy of Russia is going. But you remember from that gas and oil price chart that when Putin starts, is the president of the Russian Federation, the price of oil is skyrocketing. And he takes really good advantage of that and makes some pretty smart, savvy fiscal decisions. He is assisted in that by a brilliant Uzbek woman, in fact, named Nabiullina, who is the head of his central bank. And she is providing him with all sorts still of the advice he gets on how to manage the economy. He's also starting to appeal to Russians in particular that they should be proud to be Russian. They should be proud to be Russian Orthodox. And he literally uses the phrase, make Russia great again. You can't make this stuff up. But if you're going to be at the top of this pyramid and running the show, pretty much single-handedly with a lot of really helpful oligarchs, then people are going to rise up and say, wait a minute, this isn't what we bargained for when we finally cast off the Soviet yoke. And one of the most famous of those people was a man named Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Khodorkovsky was the richest man in Russia. One of the oligarchs. He had pretty much virtual control over all of the export of natural gas from Russia. He did that in a variety of ways that we don't have all day to talk about, but he was able to consolidate all of these privatization vouchers that the government issued and eventually corner the market on the export of natural gas. But he also had a conscience. And man, let me just take the drama away. He still has a conscience. But on television in 2003, at a roundtable discussion of the oligarchs and Vladimir Putin, Khodorkovsky raises his hand and says, but Vladimir Vladimirovich, we have one thing that we really need to focus on, and that is the corruption that is endemic in our new system. Everybody in this place and around this table is corrupt, and even you, Mr. President, are corrupt. He's on live television early in 2003. That's Khodorkovsky on the right. By late 2003, he looks like this. And you may remember that his show trial takes place overnight. He is convicted of tax fraud and sent to Siberia for 10 years of hard labor in a Siberian camp, and is only released before the 2014 Sochi Olympics as a gesture of goodwill to the people of Earth. See, I'm not so bad, Putin was saying. I'm letting Khodorkovsky out of prison. Well, Khodorkovsky has continued the struggle and still is on a speaking tour where anybody will listen to him, talking about how things really could be better in Russia if we could get to the end of the Putin era. And here's a picture of him just in the last month or so. And the best thing about this picture is that he looks hale and hearty, but he said, the only thing that was the worst about the labor camp in those 10 years was that I came out looking like Dick Cheney. Can't make this stuff up. Putin decides that he wants new oligarchs. So he gets rid of those old oligarchs. He puts them in prison or pushes them out windows or sends them into exile. He gets a whole new band of oligarchs to take control of the Russian economy. And what's unique about this group is that they aren't from the old aristocratic families of the Tsarist period or the Commissar families of the Soviet period. They're from the KGB. So virtually every one of today's powerful economic players in Russia is almost exclusively himself, a KGB trained functionary. And this brings me to The Who. How many of you remember The Who? British band, played a lot of loud rock and roll music. Well, we're not going to play any of their music because we don't have amplifiers big enough. But one of the songs that they sang in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when they were sort of dissatisfied with the quality of the prime minister in Great Britain, they sang a song that included the line, "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss." And this got me to thinking, is this true in Russia? Are they doomed to have this kind of an autocratic government forever? And so I started digging around in my archives, and I found this quote, and let me read it to you in Russian, just because it's good Russian, as you'll see when you see who wrote it. «Собрались злодеи, ограбившие свой народ, набрали солдат судей, чтобы оберегать их оргию, и пируют». It's easy for me to say. And in English, it goes like this. "The scoundrels gather together, having plundered their own people. They enlist soldiers and judges to stand guard over their orgy, and now they revel in the feast." Who said that and when? Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Many more nemesis. You know, Nemesis was the Greek goddess of divine justice. Many more start to pop up around Russia, and Putin pretty much eliminates all of them. I'm going to have a drink of water. An investigative journalist named Anna Politkovskaya, Bill Browder's attorney, Sergei Magnitsky, Boris Nemtsov, former deputy prime minister of the Russian Federation, all of them were assassinated by agents of the state. And you'll remember the story of Sergei Skripal and his daughter, a man who had been traded between the British and the Soviets in a spy trade, and he was living in Salisbury in England when the Soviet agents used nerve agents to try to assassinate him for having turned his back on Mother Russia. No, they did not succeed in killing him or his daughter, but it did result in the death of one woman who sat down on a park bench in Salisbury where they had left this terrifying nerve agent sitting on the bench. And she died, sadly. This is where we get Yevtushenko to come back. You know, he's talked about the 1990s. Now let's talk about the 2000s. He said this: "To our great chagrin, what we thought was Soviet turns out to be Russian." Medvedev takes over for those 4 years in early 2008 through 2012. You can tell from this photograph that the number 2 man, is up at the top there, is not entirely pleased with this status that he's in. It turns out that Medvedev was actually a pretty liberalizing influence on Russia, and that maybe 2008 to 2012 was a period when more rights started creeping back into Russian society. The economy was doing well because of the high oil and gas prices around the world. But then it seemed to Putin that Medvedev was starting to get too popular, so that he needed to be knocked back down a few pegs. While all that's happening in Russia, let's do a quick turn to see what's happening in Ukraine, in Ukraine. Ukraine has the disadvantage of being next door or subsumed by very large empires on their borders. The Russian Empire controlled all of Ukraine. The Soviet Empire did, even though Ukraine was part of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. Khrushchev, in the 1950s, gave it to Ukraine. There's a lot of discussion about why that happened and what were the implications of that. But that is how Crimea became part of the Ukrainian state that we recognize today. Ukraine comes from the Slavic word for borderland. It's on the edge. And one of the reasons why everybody wanted it over the last couple of thousand years is because of this. The soil in Ukraine, when I was out on a farm maybe 100 miles south of Kyiv, I asked them about this because the Chernozem, the black earth of this stretch of the steppe, is famous. You could grow anything there. Even the Soviets could grow stuff there. And the guy said, well, just put your hand down in it. And there was at least 3 feet of topsoil that looked like this. It's just extraordinary, whether that's the alluvial plain of all those deposits that came down from the north of Europe or what, I don't know exactly. But what this led to was that Ukraine was something sought after as a breadbasket by virtually every empire that you can remember from your history books. The Scythians, how many of you remember the Scythians? Almost none of us was alive then. The Greeks, see if you can follow this, the Romans, the Franks. Who are those people? Oh, the Byzantine Empire. I should wear my glasses for this, and I don't have them. Help me. The Poles, even the Lithuanians. Call them out. You can imagine why it would be that this is one of the most popular photographs in Ukraine. They were always between this empire that wanted them and that empire that wanted them, and always being pulled in every direction. This gives rise to, in a minute, your next Ukrainian language lesson, but I wanted to show you one other thing that was significant about this part of the world. It is a part of the world where if you were a peasant or a small owner of a plot, or even a boyar with a large estate, you were always in a tenuous position because somebody always wanted to come and control you. It would be only natural then that Shalom Aleichem would write his Tevye stories about this part of planet Earth. That Fiddler on the Roof is in fact in Anatyevka, which is a fictional village, but if you could find out pretty much where it is, not very far from Kharkiv in today's Ukraine. Here's your short Ukrainian lesson. You'll see why I do that. Okay, so if you would repeat after me, Mij, Dvoma, Pazhezhimi. Close. Mij, Dvoma, Pazhezhimi. And it literally means between two fires. And the Russians on one side, and all of those other empires on the other side, and then the Mongols get interested and the Ottomans get interested. They always feel as though they're between two fires. Keep that in the back of your minds. We're going to go back in time and then quickly zoom forward. So don't worry, we're not going to spend all day in the 1920s. But one significant aspect of what's in the news today is the Soviet Constitution of 1924 had some very interesting component parts. One of the things that Lenin tried to do as he shepherded this constitution through the Politburo and through the Supreme Soviet in 1924 eventually, was he wanted to prove that Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan and Armenia and Azerbaijan and Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were all voluntary members of this union. That they were all there because they wanted to be within the Union. And so every constitution since 1924, including the last Soviet constitution, said that if a constituent republic chooses to leave the Soviet Union, they are free to do so. Keep that in mind. Also, in the middle of the last century, of course, the Western Alliance is formed in Europe because we've sort of gotten the notion that after the explosion of the first atomic weapon in the Soviet Union in 1949, there needed to be a concerted defense effort in the rest of Europe, and this is when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is started. The first Secretary General of NATO was a British lord, and he said this: NATO is designed to keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Yeah, keep that in mind. We're going to fast forward now to when the wall comes down, and all of Eastern Europe says, well, wait a minute, the walls come down. We're starting to get freedom of movement. Romania, Czechoslovakia still then, the Poles, everybody outside in the old Warsaw Pact of the western flank of the Soviet Union starts to feel their own freedom juices flowing, and then the constituent republics within the Soviet Union also do. And the first one to declare its independence of the Soviet Union in 1990 was Lithuania. And Ina will never tell you this, but she led the sort of spiritual way for Lithuanian independence for a very large number of people. Ask her questions. They had some problems, though, because they had no money. They had assets, but they hadn't figured out a way to distribute them in a meaningful way. But as you probably will know, maybe, but maybe you don't, the Soviet basketball team was really good for a long, long time. But what you probably don't know is that 9/10 of their players were Lithuanian. And they were carrying the rest of the Soviet Union on their backs. And they said, we don't want to do this anymore. We want to compete as Lithuanians for Lithuania. And we want to do it next year at the Olympics in Barcelona in Spain. Well, there was a problem. They had this tremendous talent. They had a great deal of desire, but they had no money. So they decide to put out a call around the world. This is before GoFundMe was ever a reality. They put out a call around the world for somebody to help them get to Barcelona and compete in the Olympic Games. The call went out, and pretty soon a call came in. And that call came in with an offer of $50,000, which was a king's ransom in 1991 in Lithuania. And that call was from Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead. And so, you can't make this stuff up. And so, the Lithuanian national basketball team gets to Barcelona. They win the bronze medal. They did in 1996. They did in 2000 as well. Absolutely premier basketball players. And this is what their uniforms looked like. It's just too good a story. So the Lithuanians, though, aren't the only one of the 15 republics. The Russians are starting to say, well, maybe we should get out of the Soviet Union. And certainly the Ukrainians are doing that too. And so it happens in 1991 that Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan get together and declare that they are withdrawing, as their constitutional right guarantees, they're withdrawing from the Soviet Union. And at that point, the Soviet Union, as we all know, in 1991, falls apart. Let's move forward. 2008 is a milestone for many reasons, but one of them is the United States decides, after 15 years of NATO expansion to the east, they decide that the last two pieces of the NATO alliance are going to be Ukraine and Georgia. And that is a bridge too far for Vladimir Putin. And even though they say in this official declaration from NATO that those two former Soviet republics, Ukraine and Georgia, will become members of NATO. Not could, not can, not should, will. Then Vladimir Putin goes on record and says this: Georgia and Ukraine becoming part of NATO is a direct threat to Russia. He said that in 2008. He then immediately starts sending troops into those two countries. He does that in 2008 in Georgia. Russian troops still occupy these parts of that independent nation. He has a huge party that he sinks tremendous amount of money into in 2014 in Sochi for the Olympic Games. And the rest of the world has sort of soured on Russia and are only sending minor delegations to these Olympics. In the case of the United States, I think the head of our delegation was the deputy assistant to the assistant deputy of state. Putin is furious that he's not getting the recognition and respect from the rest of the world. And then, to make matters worse, his ally, Yanukovych, who is the president of Ukraine, gets kicked out of Ukraine and seeks refuge in Russia, and the Revolution of Dignity in the Euromaidan, in the central square of Kyiv, forces him out, and the response from the Putin administration is to start invading Crimea in earnest. You may remember stories about the little green men that appeared somehow without insignia on their uniforms, and they, pretty much without a shot, take over Crimea, that peninsula down in that reaches out into the Black Sea, and they pretty much take it in a very short period of time. What's significant about this in historical terms is that this is the first time that we get to see someone and something in action. And that someone is Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was the head of the Wagner Group. This is where Wagner gets its start in life, by providing troops to the Russian Federation that they can use that aren't really official Russian soldiers. While all that's happening, what do you think is happening on television in Ukraine? Well, this goofy young sort of history teacher, a guy named Vladimir Zelensky, is on a sitcom called Sluga Narodu, Servant to the People, and he plays a well-meaning, a moral, deeply moral history teacher who wants to teach real history. Well, eventually he gains in popularity, and in the sitcom, he starts a political party called Servant to the People, and he's elected in the sitcom president. That was 2015. Within 4 years, the exact same thing happens in reality, and he is elected president of the country. So he goes into the office of the president of Ukraine as a seasoned stand-up comedian, but he has no other governing background or experience. Within a few months, where does he land? He lands in this chair, and he's pressured into providing evidence about Hunter Biden's laptop in exchange for American support for the Ukrainian military. That was a low moment. His relationship with Joe Biden was much better. As you know, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the United States provided the lion's share of support for Ukraine. When the regime changes, the government changes in the United States, things go sour again with the Trump administration. But I'm not leaving you there. Then they get better, as Monty Python would say. They end up in a pretty good relationship between Zelensky and President Trump. President Trump has called Zelensky now a winner. And that is very high in the pantheon of President Trump, if you are a winner. But back in February of 2022, this is what the Russian invasion of this independent nation next door looked like. And this is what it looked like, not on the map, but on the ground in reality. A tremendous devastation of mostly residential areas throughout Ukraine. The odd power plant, the odd military formation, but almost exclusively targeting places where people live. Avdiivka looks like this today. Miraculously, after 3.5 years now of war, this former superpower hasn't really gained any territory. They have about 20% of Ukrainian territory, and of course their demands are that they should have it all. Proximate causes. This is where I'm going to fish my glasses out, because I can read them out here. Ha! Proximate causes. They lose their ally in Ukraine. Brexit. You may not know this, but Putin and company bankrolled the Brexit effort to get start a crack in the European Union, and maybe then they could carve off other parts of it as well, because the long-term goal, to my mind, of Vladimir Putin is that there is no solid Western alliance. His argument is not just with Ukraine, it's really wanting to fracture the rest of Western Europe. Our departure from Afghanistan in 2021 that was so humiliating and immoral in many ways made Putin think that we were weak, that we couldn't mount a response. Putin was clearly bugged by the fact that the Ukrainians were, even though they had their own problems, they were managing to have a prosperous democratic country right on their border full of Slavs, not Russians, but Ukrainians. That really was a model he didn't want to have on his borders. The Ukrainians probably made a mistake in passing a piece of legislation that downgraded Russian as a national language. That was probably a mistake. They also said, you know, you're not going to be able to keep that naval base that you've had in Sevastopol for all these years, in the same way that the United States has a naval base in Guantanamo. The Russian Federation and the Soviets had a naval base at the very base of the Crimean Peninsula. And Putin's, of course, interest in making Russia great again. And by that, I don't mean making it the Soviet Union. I mean making that the Russian Empire. And empires in Putin's mind include a sphere of influence, maybe on all of their borders, so that all of those countries are compliant with whatever it is that the central superpower wants them to do. As we know, recently, President Trump and President Putin met in Anchorage. And then within 3 days, virtually every leader from the European Union appeared in Washington, D.C. with President Zelensky to try to get some kind of a new paradigm in place so that the whole world would know that Russia couldn't get away with what they were doing in Ukraine. On his way to Anchorage, of course, the foreign minister of the Russian Federation, a man named Sergei Lavrov, that you've seen on television probably quite a bit, what does he wear to the Anchorage summit? This. I don't know if you can see this, but that says USSR on the front of his sweatshirt. And he's sending what he thought was funny, a very subtle message about wanting to reestablish control over all of this territory. This, of course, led me back to Sun Tzu. Always go back to 2,500 years ago to China. And it's try to figure out who Putin is and why he's doing what he's doing and why Russia thinks it should have this empire. And I'm going to motor through this pretty quickly. In 2005, Putin said this about NATO and the demise of the Soviet Union. He said it was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Well, you know, quite a bit happened in the 20th century. And many of us in the West, think that the almost bloodless transformation of the Soviet Union into 15 constituent republics was a good thing. Putin thinks it was the worst thing ever in the 20th century. And this is what Putin would think of that would drive him to distraction at night. He would think of these NATO countries expanding to the east and erasing his sphere of influence all the way up to and including Ukraine and Georgia. I'm trying to get inside Putin's head here, but to be inside the Ukrainians' head for just a minute longer, they've got NATO on this side, they've got the Russian bear on that side. What does that make them think of? That makes them think of being between two fires yet again. The idea that during the Soviet period, the Warsaw Pact countries, here in pink, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, and East Germany, they provided that buffer that the Soviet Union could always hopefully count on. Every now and again, the spirit of freedom would bubble up there in Hungary in 1956, in the Czechoslovakia in 1968, and it would have to be managed from the Soviet standpoint. But they had that sort of expansion joint, if you're familiar with paving at all. I drive on I-5 quite a bit these days. But the thing that bothers Putin the most about Ukraine is their form of government and their prosperity. One of the most looted items in the Ukrainian war against Russia, in the Russian war against Ukraine, one of the most looted items is a flush toilet. Taken back to the little village in Siberia somewhere so that mom or grandmom can have indoor plumbing. 25% of the Russian Federation population lives without indoor plumbing. But go to Freedom House anytime you want, because you can look up every country on the planet and see how we're doing in terms of our political rights and our civil liberties. Well, on a scale of 100, Norway does pretty darn well. On a scale of 100, we do almost as well. We're, striving to make a more perfect union all the time. But then when you look at Ukraine coming out of the Soviet period, they too are doing their dangdest, I think, to guarantee political rights and civil liberties and to fight corruption. And a score of 51 out of 100 is not bad. But right next door, of course, this is Russia's score. Putin would love this map to be the map of the 21st century and beyond. These are all natural gas pipelines from Russia into Western Europe, tethering them together. He would like the Nord Stream 2 pipelines coming down from the northern part of Russia straight into the German industrial centers in the northern part of Germany. But as you all probably remember, those natural gas pipelines have been sabotaged. It isn't entirely clear who did it, but if it weren't the Ukrainians, it probably should have been. We're motoring in on running out of time, but I'm going to leave time for questions. But I wanted to share a couple more things. The news is full of stories about Putin and company getting support from Xi Jinping in China, from Kim Jong-un in North Korea, from the Ayatollah in Iran. But there's one other group that Putin still gets a great deal of financial support from, and that sadly is Western Europe. Still takes the lion's share of pipeline natural gas from Russia. They've decreased their amount of that from about 45% of their total usage to 19%, but 19% of billions of cubic feet of natural gas is still funding his war effort. Trying to get into Putin's head, there's a whole series of photographs like this where Putin is meeting leaders of the Western world. And when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came out of this meeting, one of her aides said, "Well, what was that like?" And she said, "I've just met the king of man-spreading." You women may need to explain this to your neighbor. Angela Merkel was also a powerful, bright woman that Putin didn't get along with. Angela Merkel, before this summit meeting, as she was Chancellor of Germany, a month before this, she had been attacked by a dog. And so the first thing Putin does is let one of his very large hounds into the room. And Angela Merkel said this in a moment of extraordinary candor. "I understand why he has to do this, to prove he's a man." Merkel said, "He's afraid of his own weakness." And if you watch Russian television, you'll see images like this all the time, like 2, 3, 4 times a week. You'll see Vladimir Putin doing something really manly out in Russia. And it's just a phenomenon that psychologists and psychiatrists would have a field day with. One last nemesis, and then we're going to go to your questions. Sadly, this is one of the nemeses that didn't make it. Alexei Navalny is probably the most famous of the people who turned on Putin and to try to illuminate and then counter the extraordinary corruption involved in his management of the mafia state. But as you'll also see, Navalny quickly ends up in prison and then quickly ends up dead. And that nothing more could typify Vladimir Putin's hold on power in Russia. So, what explains Putin's grip on Russia is something that when I send these slides to Ina and that you can go through them in the luxury of your own apartments and see the next 5 slides that tries to explain how it is he's consolidated his grip. But going to motor through that to this. Alexander III was a Tsar at the end of the 19th century. He was a despot of mammoth proportions, not just because he was so big, but because he was so brutal. And his motto in life was, I want to appeal to your orthodoxy, to your nationalism, and to the blessedness of this autocracy. One man rule. And if Putin had his own motto, that would be it. Orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationalism. To give you a better sense of maybe what Putin's like in the depths of his soul, I keep watching this short video of him meeting Mohammed bin Salman. This is about a month after it becomes clear that Mohammed bin Salman has ordered the assassination and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi, who was writing for the Washington Post. The glee on these two faces is hard to miss. Okay. In 2000, when you went to Russia and you bought Matryoshki dolls, nesting dolls, this is the one you got. Lenin big, then Stalin, and then Gorbachev, etc., all the way down. And the little one was Putin. But if you go now and buy Matryoshki, this is what they look like. Just to give you a sense. So we're going to motor through that, and that, because you're going to see these when you read when you see your slides. And this is where a couple of things I need to mention. On your resource list, I left off a whole bunch of really important books. But I think one of the best ones to humanize all of Russia is this one. And I suspect you've all read it. And if you haven't, I saw a copy in your library. And if you can't read it, then you can go to the 8-part series on Paramount Plus, which to my mind is excellent. So one or the other of those is available to you to get a real handle on Russia. Okay, I'm sorry about taking up so much of your time, but here's your chance. Remember what you did before? Let's try it again. Just raise your hands up. Yeah, good. Okay, now here's your chance for a little Q&A before the benediction. Could you put on more lights? No. The score is 6-3 Seattle. I love it when I know a student has my full attention, you know.
This is already on. It's already on. It was.
Questions? Comments? Yes, sir. Right there.
I think it's on.
It's on. Trump seems to have limited bandwidth, and right now his attention seems to be exclusively focused on Gaza. Is that good, bad, or indifferent for Ukraine's war effort?
That's a really good question, and I think I agree with you that he's focused on the Middle East right now. I suspect that if he can get it to a kind of place of quiescence for a while, then he'll be able to focus again on something else. But what that something else is going to be, I'm not entirely sure. He has at least landed at a spot where he is as skeptical of Putin as he should have been from the beginning. For some reason, and it may be that there's a certain temperament there, I think President Trump would love not to have an independent judiciary, would love not to have a Washington Post, would love not to have a fill in the blank, a legislature, because he would be able to run the show. So I think President Trump and President Putin share a kind of a characteristic, but Putin is so much better at it and so much more ruthless, and not to his credit, but he is he is really the consummate autocrat. Yeah. So
And,
I'm hopeful. Yes.
and Stephen Miller. It'd be interesting to put a picture of Putin and Miller next to each other, because I think they look very alike.
Uh-huh. Thank you. Uh-huh. Yes, sir. It's coming. Stereo.
I think one mic's enough. Thank you. This is not a serious question, but as a musician, I wonder if you have seen the film clip of Putin working with a jazz combo, singing an American jazz standard called Blueberry Hill. Have you seen that?
I have seen that.
Okay.
Yeah. I wince when I watch that, because what he's clearly doing there is he's trying to convince people of his humanity. And after all these years, I don't think there's much in there that could be called humane or human. And his willingness to drag his whole country down with him is just appalling to me, because, and you'll see in a minute with our benediction, I have tremendous faith in and gratitude for all that Russia has done for humanity across a wide range of disciplines. And to see him sort of besmirch the brand really bothers me. But what he was doing with Blueberry Hill was trying to sort of curry favor with people who would say, well, he's not so bad after all. The same is true with the Cats song from his movie, right? I'm not so bad. I'm not one of those old commissars. I'm something new. It turns out he wasn't. Yeah. Questions? Right back there.
Our country's pretty divided. What about Ukraine? What are the percentages of people who speak Russian? What about those areas that are owned now by Russia?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. In the eastern side of Ukraine, as you know, probably the dominant language around the dinner table was Russian. And as you get farther and farther to the west, it becomes Ukrainian. And then if you go far enough, it becomes Polish. So there are all sorts of political linguistics things going on in Russia. But the last poll I saw before the full-scale invasion was that both in the Russian-speaking side and in the rest of it, there was still a preponderance of people, more than 50%, that opposed any Russian aggression against them. They didn't want to become part of the Russian Federation. They were pretty happy being in Ukraine. The standard of living was twice what it was in Russia. Twice. But we have to also keep in mind that Vladimir Zelensky, Russian is his native language. And here is this Jewish Ukrainian president of the country, and he had to learn Ukrainian after he became president. So there's a great example of the sort of linguistic, delineations falling apart. It didn't really matter, but the pride in being Ukrainian seems like it steamrolled every other consideration. Yes, ma'am?
What is the national language of Ukraine?
Well, it's Ukrainian. What is the national language of Ukraine? It's Ukrainian, and I wish that they would put Russian back on the list. But they are not, for some reason, they're not of a mind to be thinking very in a friendly, charitable way about Russia these days. So I don't think that's going to happen. But I really think it was a mistake for them to try to, do some social engineering by eliminating Russian as a national language. That was a mistake. Right
Yes.
here. Right here. You're next.
The map you showed of the EU getting gas
Yes.
from Russia, especially Hungary and Slovakia, it showed pipelines.
Yeah.
Are they going through Ukraine?
They are going through Ukraine.
Can they be stopped?
Well, that's a great question. Ukraine actually makes revenue off those transit pipelines that are going somewhere else. But this, in one of the slides we motored through too fast, I have this idea. You know that one of the problems is as I said, Western Europe is still using too much natural gas from Russia. The three countries that are the worst offenders are Hungary, Slovakia, and more recently, the Czech Republic. And they all three have now leaders or longtime leaders who are pretty pro-Putin because they're getting essentially $20 a barrel oil and gas from the Russian Federation. They're being subsidized by Putin. What if President Trump called up the CEO of ExxonMobil and said, hey, I need about 7 million barrels of oil a year for these three little countries in Eastern Europe, and I'd like to give them this gas and this oil. And that would, they could either continue to pay their $20 a barrel or get it for free from us. ExxonMobil would be happy. I would be happy. Trump would be happy. Or Viktor Orban would be miserable because he'd have to turn to his people and say, oh, now we're really not going to be pro-Moscow. We're going to be pro, where is ExxonMobil headquarters? Texas, let's call it. And so I think that's one of the things we could actually do. We could actually seize or loan the frozen assets, the Russian sovereign funds that are in U.S. banks, about 12 billion of them, but there are 288 billion of them in Belgium. And the move, watch your news over the next week or two. I think we're going to gain access to that, provide it to Ukraine for their defense against Russia. We had a question back here.
I'd like your opinion of Zelensky. He, considering his lack of diplomatic background and all, he is portrayed, and I somewhat believe that naively perhaps, that he deserves a great deal of credit.
I think he's an extraordinary human being who is a great example of rising to the occasion. I don't think he had the chops to do this or knew what he was getting into. He knew that part of his country had already been invaded by Russia, and he ran on a platform of European Union integration. We're part of Europe now. And that was the right message for Ukraine at that time and still is. But to watch him, he's done two things, I think. One really positive, and that is growing into the job. But the other thing that's happened to him is that he's aged about 20 years in these last 5 or 6 years. And so I'm sorry for him, but man alive, he's still going at it day in and day out, visiting the troops, schmoozing with Western European powers, going back and forth to Washington, D.C., and I think in the end, figuring out a modus vivendi with Trump, so that they're now on the same page, thinking that maybe Ukraine can actually win this thing and push Russia out. One more before we have a benediction. You're next.
Thank you. I am immensely impressed and with what you have taught us about what's been going on between Russia and the countries surrounding it. And I would like to ask you your idea of what's going to happen 10, 20 years from now.
Yeah.
Make a political prediction.
Yeah. I will have aged 50 years in that time. Whoops. Of course, I'm reminded of what Yogi Berra said in this moment. Predictions are difficult, particularly ones about the future. It is hard to, we can't, the status quo is not sustainable. Russia can't sustain it. Ukraine can't sustain it. But if we don't come out of this with Ukraine whole and free, then I'm sorry for Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and Poland, and every peripheral country around this very large Russian empire wannabe. And so I think this is the moment where we really have to stand in solidarity and improve their U.S. support, Western European support, popular support, particularly from the global South, who are not really participating in this because they too are getting $20 a barrel oil from the Russians. And so I think we need to do a whole lot more. And if we do it, I'm convinced that we could come up to this sort of modus vivendi, this figuring out how to live together, even though we've got this Russian, this sense that they should, in fact, gather all the Russian-speaking lands. This is a phrase that you historians will remember from Europe when Germany decided that it needed to have more and more Lebensraum, and that led them to invade virtually every country in Europe. But one.
What about Trump's idea of trying to get Yugoslavia's rare earth metals in exchange for more support? Do you think that's going to win? Help Yugoslavia win?
Well, yeah. You know what's funny about rare earth metals? They're everywhere. What's limited is the interest in and the process you have to go through to refine them. The Chinese have been doing it no matter what the environmental costs, and that's why they have a sort of corner on the market of all those rare earth minerals and metals. But they're everywhere. They're in Montana. They're in Washington. But will we pay the price to refine them so that we can use them in our smartphones and in our batteries? I don't know the answer to that, but I think the willingness of Ukraine to enter into that, you can have half the profits. No, okay, because that's so far off in the distant future. There's a wonderful map of Greenland. You may have heard of Greenland. There's a map of it that shows where all the mineral deposits are, all the way around the entirety of the island. And then the next map shows how many are being processed now. 2. Yeah, just 2 way down here in the sort of warm part of Greenland. So I don't think, maybe we'll think of a way that we can make smartphone and batteries and AI work without all of those rare earth metals. Okay. Quickly now, this is it. As you know from my intro, I think that there's a lot has been sacrificed over these last several years. And one of them is what it is that Russia has contributed to all of us. And I sat down last night and I said to myself, what other country could have provided these names to all of us? Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Pushkin, Eisenstein, Kandinsky, Gagarin, Tereshkova, Mendeleev, Pavlov, Tchaikovsky, Prokofiev, Stravinsky, Shostakovich, Diaghilev, Balanchine, Nureyev, Baryshnikov, Pavlova, Sharapova, this is tennis, Kornikova, Corbett, Yul Brynner. You probably didn't know he was born in Russia. No other country that I can think of has made that depth of contribution to us. And so, as a last word to all of you, with second to the last word being my thanks for spending this time with me, and sorry to have gone overboard. But here is one image I want to leave you with. And one last message. And with that, Horizon House, thank you for having me.
Thank you, David Fenner. Will we ever have another speaker who can top him? I challenge you to it. We will have to have you back again for an update of what is happening. But I want to make a few more comments. If you did not get a sheet as you were walking in because we ran out, I have the attachment online. So just let me know and I will let you have it. Also, somebody brought up the idea of Stephen Miller compared to what in the Soviet Union. Roseanne Royer, the former wife of the former mayor of Seattle, sent me a link which has a parallel of what Lenin was, what his life was, what his approach to governing was, and Stephen Miller. And it's an absolute parallel, one to the other. If you want it, let me know, and I will send it to you. And there was something else that I forgot. Thank you for coming, and we will see you again. This is on behalf of the World Concerns Committee. Thank you, and thank you again.